Hamilton East has an identity crisis. No longer is it just that side of the river in Kirikiriroa, Hamilton. They're going to be getting an all new MP no matter who wins when it comes to the election this year. That's why we're going to be looking at them in the public gallery. Hamilton East is a fascinating electorate. Some people consider it a bellwether, but it's not really that at all. And there's a sort of mindset from the people of Kirikiriroa about what exactly makes up Hamilton East. You see, when you've got a river that runs right through the middle of your city, it's pretty easy to break down which part is which. And for a really long time, Hamilton East was literally anybody living on the eastern side of the Waikato River within Kirikiriroa. But just before the 2020 election, the lines were redrawn, and some of those northern suburbs, which tend to be an older group of people who are much more affluent and tend to vote more conservatively, those were lumped in under Hamilton West, which means that the makeup of Hamilton East suddenly changes a little bit. There's a lot more prominence of younger voters around the University of Waikato, and they tend to vote Green, which was really strange. If you look at a map of where people voted for which particular party, it's like concentric rings out from the university around the Green Party. One of the other really fascinating things to sit down and look at here is the ethnicity makeup. Hamilton East has a lower than average score for Pākehā European members and a much higher rate of Maori, Pacific Islanders and Asians living within that community than you'd find on the national average, which means that you get a whole bunch of people from a whole bunch of different walks of life all sitting there voting for, well, the same thing in a way. You see, every election since 1996, our first MMP election, the candidate that's won the most votes has also been in the party that's won the most party votes for Hamilton East. There's never been a differential. But what we have seen is that when a party's been in power for a while, the voter turnout tends to drop. And when the voter turnout increases, that's when there's been a switch in who ends up being the MP. And seeing that come into play is really quite interesting, especially when we come down to this year's election. Because Hamilton East has had two MPs essentially for the last couple of terms. Initially, it had David Bennett, who was the elected MP for Hamilton East, and Jamie Strange, who was a list MP for Labour. At the last election, that swapped. Jamie won the seat, but David was still on as a list MP. Both of those people are retiring at this election, which means that there's a whole new seat up for grabs. So far, 4 candidates have put their hat in the ring for the seat of Hamilton East, but only 3 of them are really kind of running for it. Ash Palmer, who is a liquor store owner in the region, is running for the ACT Party deliberately to get their boosting of the party vote. He's not really wanting to win that particular seat, but at number 13 on the ACT list, under current polling, there is a possibility he could still make it into Parliament. Ash is really big on youth crime, and he used to be a National Party voter but felt disillusioned by their policies towards youth crime and felt that some of ACT's policies were much more in line with his thinking, which included ankle bracelets for kids and boot camps for youth offenders. Then you've got somebody like Alex Corkin, who's running for the Top Party. Now, he's a tech worker, he works within that industry and has for a while, and he's really keen to see changes in the way that we deal with things like the tax system and the education system, and felt that Top was a much better fit for him than any of the other major parties. When it comes to the 2 major parties that are running candidates, though, you've got Georgie Dansey from Labour, and you've got Ryan Hamilton from National. Georgie is a small business owner. She's a union worker who's been involved in the management of local unions around education. She's a young parent, she has young children. She works within the community and has lived within the community for over 20 years. Ryan is a Hamilton City Councillor, and like many other candidates around the country, if he were to win, this would trigger a by-election process to replace him in that seat. He's a conservative Christian who most recently made national headlines when he showed up to a meeting of sovereign citizens who had issued a death writ for some of the other councillors in Hamilton City to turn around and tell them he was one of them and not to panic, which is a really fascinating way to do things. There's been a lot of comments around Ryan and his Christian beliefs and how that's going to come into play and how he will represent the diversity of Hamilton East. But that hasn't stopped Jamie Strange. The 2 of them actually go to the same church. So is that really such a big issue? What I'm going to do first, though, is have a talk to Dan about what he knows about the candidates. You see, Dan's in a really unique position. He's just come back from an international trip where he was away for a number of weeks as the campaign ramped up, which means the difference between before he left and what happened when he came back this week is stark. So let's see what his observations were around these changes over that short period of time.
I noticed throwing away a few national signs about, a few ACT ones, a couple of minor party ones. I couldn't even tell you what the minor party was. It's just more like a driving along. Oh, that's a party. I don't know. And that's it. You don't even remember who they were. That's terrible. Like them or the party. I don't expect to see a sign and never remember the party. Sorry, remember the person, but the party should be able to go, that's a Labour sign, that's an ACT sign, etc. And then since I've got back, I've just seen a lot more signs. The Labour signs look unbalanced to me. Well, they've got the no, the people they've got not the PM, the head of the party and the local candidate, but in the way the picture's set up, he's quite a bit forward. Like it's a bit, it's just a graphical thing. It's nothing to do with the politics. It's just graphically, I'm like, seen lots of minor party things around, and I've seen posts on social media about these signs everywhere, and people, oh, they can't be up. I'm like, well, actually, they can. And then comments about people selling out. Some people will only let one person put up a sign, and others will sell out and put all the people up. That's your biggest issue. There's something wrong with it.
Realistically, this election is going to come down to two candidates. It's either going to be Georgie or Ryan. Let's have a look at each of them in detail. Georgie is local. She's lived in the community for 20 plus years. She's got a family there. She's got young children. She's a business owner. In fact, she was the first gym owner in the country to meet living wage specifications for her staff. She's worked really closely with education unions, having been involved heavily in that movement. And she's done everything she can to be seen in front of people, going to meetings and events, schools, active social media presence, as well as radio interviews, all of it, everywhere. She's working really hard to be seen in this election. The downside with Georgie is she's a bit of an unknown in comparison to Ryan. Ryan already has a built-in profile, but we'll go into that shortly. Let's see what Dan's impressions are of Georgie and what she brings to the table as a candidate.
As a person, she seems to be quite nice. I haven't heard much of her political side, but as a being a business owner myself in Hamilton, you hear of people and you know of people. Their gym, BT is it? But I know they were living wage accredited. I think they were the first gym. But just about advocacy. Well, she's a Labour candidate, so it's all about Labour, looking after your workforce. But you should anyway. Well, that's my view of business. You look after your workforce, and they'll look after you. I think the ability to be an MP is a desire thing more than a training. Like you can go and study political science, but you can't do an apprenticeship in becoming a politician, can you? Exactly. I think it comes down to life skills. She knows how to negotiate. She's got kids. I think it's a set of life skills. She understands business, the struggles around business, children, so cost of living.
For the National Party, they've got relatively high-profile local Ryan Hamilton. It probably doesn't hurt that his surname is the same as the city. Ryan's been a Hamilton City Councillor since 2018 when he won a by-election that occurred because of the death of the late Philip Young, who was a city councillor. His rise to power, as it were, was a long one. He'd been running perennially in local body elections for quite some time before finally being elected, and since then he's worked with council on a number of issues. But during the pandemic, he was one of the few voices that was against things like mandates in council facilities and vaccination passes being required to use them that were being mandated by the entire country at the time. He was also very recently at a meeting of sovereign citizens where they invited a number of local councillors to come along so they could issue them with execution writs for their role in the pandemic. And while the councillors that were issued those writs left very quickly, Hamilton stayed behind and tried to calm the crowd down, apparently by claiming he was one of them, and brought up his voting record. Ryan is a conservative Christian, and that can be irking for some people. But Ryan also doesn't live in the ward that he's running in. He lives just outside of it, and it's a big issue that's been in place for a while for Hamilton, and that it's a feeder city, which means if you live just outside the electorate, you're still going to be using the resources of the city, but you're not going to be paying rates there, which, doesn't always sit well with some voters. And they have had a number of councillors over the years who have fitted into that category. So, Ryan, is he different? What's the perspective that he's got, and how do voters see him?
From what you see in the media, I haven't heard a lot about her. She seems to be quite sort of normal, but he's just done some things that are a bit dumb. He went to I think it was the 15-minute city thing, which people just misinterpret that horrendously. It makes me laugh. We're going to be locked in our bubbles. And he sort of realised he'd done something wrong, and then was trying to backpedal out of it. Just made himself look dumb. Oh, I didn't know it was, and it's like, well, if you look at your social media stuff from a while ago, you'd know what it is. That's the problem these days, is social media. In our day, we didn't have it, so no one can see my dumb shit. I don't have a problem with people's religious beliefs. But if they use that as their sole source of reasoning, I think that's bad, because they're not representing the religious people that just that will get out and vote. Whereas there's a lot of people that are like, he's an idiot, I won't vote against him, I just won't vote at all, kind of thing. So we're all out our own personal reviews, but you shouldn't try and jam them down other people's throats. You can use that for some of your reasoning, but it can't be the sole source of your reasoning.
When it comes to the issues facing the people of Hamilton East, there is, of course, a range of problems out there. One of the big ones is crime. There are a number of pockets of areas within that particular electorate that are controlled by gangs, and that's really problematic for a number of reasons. A lot of the news headlines around crime in the region also deal specifically with young people and youth offenders, which means that depending on how you want to approach the way of fixing this, you're either looking at one party that's sitting there saying we should lock kids up and put ankle bracelets in them, or another party who wants more of restorative justice issues sorted through things like family court. It's an interesting issue to have to deal with.
And then Ash Kumar for the ACT Party, business owner. He's even before I step into politics, I do follow him on LinkedIn. He's a big promoter of safety in businesses, especially being in the liquor and dairy industry. Like, everyone's getting robbed every other week. Like, you see stories where, and he's bringing to light the burglaries and stuff like that. One of them had a attempted burglary on the Friday night, the back door, and they just sort of broke the door, didn't get in, damaged some stuff, and they boarded that up, and they were waiting there. Like, someone stayed there all weekend to make sure it was secure as well. And then on the Sunday morning, they ran around the front of the shop. And the place has been hit multiple times. And there's dairies here that are closed. Just no. Leases are coming up or getting out of leases. They're just not had enough. Like, for example, the ACT candidate, the crime thing, he's too extreme with it. I think they're too extreme with their policies. Like, does the ACT Party want to make a Nazi Germany? Must be all in prison, ankle bracelets, and all these sorts of things. And it's just like, I can understand your frustration, but it's proven not to work. And everyone's going about charging these kids with youth with adult crime. That's fine, but no one's mentioned the parents. I don't know whether I grew up in a different era or, well, I did. Well, it's, if I did something wrong, which is very, very, very rarely, if at all, my parents are probably 10th in the queue to kick my ass. So, I just think their policies are all very extreme on those key topics, which I think for a lot of people the key thing is cost of living and crime. Would that be fair to say? That's big things at the moment. That's what this election's on. I feel, and it's I'm going to create almost like acts like let's create concentration camps and a prison society type thing, but it's don't feel it's addressing the whole issues. It starts at home. Punished up, punished. Well, some way of involving punishing the parents somehow, or I don't know. I don't quite know the answer. That's why I'm not in politics. But yeah, everyone's policy just seem extreme.
Because Hamilton East is statistically a different makeup to the rest of the country, there are some really fantastically weird little quirks in the population itself. For example, it has quite a high retired population and a relatively high student population, which brings down the average age of the electorate. Most people in the electorate are under the age of 35, and it has an employment rate of about 55%, which does seem kind of low, but a large chunk of those people are out studying or will be parents with kids who are stay at home parents or retired. But that also means that the average wage for the region is really low. It's less than $35,000 a year, and that causes some serious problems. Poverty is obviously a driver for a lot of societal issues. And when you're dealing with a group like students, for example, who are already on forced lower incomes because they might be means tested or they're using a student allowance to survive and supplementing it with a bit of work, you get a whole bunch of disparity in there between the haves and the have-nots. Now, in terms of tax plans that have been put on the table, the Green Party tax plan, which offers a universal basic income essentially, would actually be the most beneficial for both those retired people and students. But when you look at what National and Labour are offering, therefore what their candidates are offering, it's a little bit different there as well. Labour's looking at some really targeted sort of tax relief in certain areas, and National's target taxes plan that they released last week is not really all that friendly towards people who earn less than $40,000 a year. In fact, the vast majority of them would end up worse off than they did beforehand. So, how much does tax come into play when it comes to deciding who to vote for? And for somebody like Dan who runs a small business, does the idea of a tax plan that benefits society and those around him more than benefits him and his business appeal? Is it a factor that he really takes on board when it comes to how he's going to decide where to put his vote?
No, it's been nothing about business. From it. That's all about personal tax cuts, and yeah, that's all about the individuals. There's nothing about business. They're all going about, oh, we're going to get the economy moving, blah blah blah, but they're offering nothing for business.
Now, I have to admit, this is actually not an area that I've looked into. It's, for some weird reason, something I just haven't really had a chance to dig around with. But Dan is absolutely spot on when he says that there is nothing that's been put out there yet in relation directly to small businesses from any of the political parties. And that's quite fascinating. In Hamilton East, your two main candidates for the seat both own and run small businesses. You'd think that that would be a priority for them. But when you look at the policy points that have come out, they're pretty thin on the ground. The Greens, for example, have said that they want to encourage a circular economy, which should benefit small businesses. But they don't give you the exact details on how that plan would operate. In fact, the closest thing I've been able to find to a really specific policy for small businesses has come from New Zealand First, and that's they want commercial entities, or small businesses as it were, to offer very specifically demarcated gendered bathrooms, and where necessary, those need to be policed so that the right people are using them. And that is not a policy that has anything to do with encouraging small business growth and helping small business owners. It's kind of weird. Even looking at our two major parties, their biggest policy points that they've got on their websites are dated during 2021 and 2022 in the midst of COVID, and it's all about COVID recovery and helping the economy that way. That's a really severely lacking area for our politicians and our parties to have not covered so close to the election. And I'm genuinely surprised by this. Dan has a really specific thing that he wants looked at when it comes to small businesses and employment. He feels at the moment there's actually an issue around being able to fire somebody, especially when there's certain rules and regulations that you have to follow. But if you've got a staff member who's not working out, what's going to be best for them and for the company has to be taken on board.
Actually, employment law needs changing. Yeah, it is really hard when when it is justified. It is really hard to dismiss someone. You've You've got to follow so many processes. It's really hard to actually dismiss someone. And having just been through that with the 90-day trial process, which is legal for a business under 20 employees, I had someone recently tell me it's not legal. It got abolished. No, because what Labor did was they got away from all business because these massive companies would just hire people for 3 months and then move them on. And I had to make the choice of move them on when I could, because do you take the effort and try and fix them, train them, but I'm a small business, I can't take the risk. So yeah, that's something business, small business employment law is something that I'm very much interested in with this election.
One of the other rather unique elements of this year's election in Hamilton East is kind of conspicuous by its absence. This is the first time this century that the Green Party will not be sporting a candidate in the Hamilton East electorate, and it seems to have been noticed.
Realistically, most people, in my opinion, there's 4 parties that people are going to vote for, which we don't have a candidate for one of them. National, Labor, ACT and Greens. We don't have a Greens candidate. You look back 3, 4 elections ago when Greens got like 20-something% of the vote. That's when the Greens collapsed. They got like 9% the next election. I think they may have, they got mid-20s, I think it was. And I remember talking with a few people at the time going, it's going to be a 3-horse race in the future. Like we discussed and went, yeah, I can see the progress they've made. It's going to come down to there's going to be 3 parties, not just you could have potentially have a Green-led government with a coalition Green-led government, but they disappeared, and we've got no candidate. I think they're missing out on potential party vote by not being there. Greens have been Greens and ACT, in fact, have been around for a long time, and they've, I was going to say, swayed a lot of governments. I don't know if that's quite the right wordings. They've managed to get in and have some influence, and it's been good influence. Dare I say it, I suppose. But yeah, I don't see it as bad influence.
That election that Dan is talking about was the 2011 general election, where the Green Party ended up winning 14 seats in the House. It is their largest ever number of MPs that they've had, and at that time, they were the 3rd largest member of the House in terms of party presence. Not having a candidate in Hamilton East this year, though, could be a bit of a double-edged sword. On one hand, you won't have a candidate there actively going out trying to booster the Green Party vote in the electorate. But on the other hand, for Georgie, that means that there's no Green Party candidates siphoning off votes from the Labour Party. And that's really interesting because we've not seen that happen this century. It'll be really fascinating to see whether or not that small number of votes that tend to go for the candidate move over to the new candidate for Labour, because that's kind of how MMP tends to work. On the right, though, you've got Nationals Ryan Hamilton and ACT's Ash Palmer, and Ash is actively out there looking for the party vote, but people are still going to vote for him if they're hardcore ACT fans. And Hamilton East has some hardcore ACT fans. That's actually where the party secretary lived for many years. So it's going to be fascinating to see whether or not that one little change on the outside has a major effect on the way that people vote for the candidate that they want to be their MP. On top of that, this is a race at the moment that's completely bereft of weird little conspiracy parties. There's nobody there at the moment representing Freedoms NZ or New Zealand First or Democracy NZ or the Liz Gunn Party. The crazy ones that are full of conspiracy theories that make a lot of noise and can cause a lot of damage. They're not in this electorate. but they are making their voices heard through things like social media, yelling and screaming online, which is never a great thing to have happen. So what does Dan think is the next logical step? Because we've realistically only got about a week and a half until the full list of candidates gets released by the Electoral Commission.
It's certainly going to heat up. There's more things going to come out. I imagine there's going to be more candidates that are popping up. There'll be some shuffling. Yeah, they will. There'll be some pop up. It won't be. That sounds bad. It won't be major candidates. It'll be all those minor parties.
This is going to be an absolutely fascinating election to sit down and watch on election night because, well, on paper, the two main candidates for the seat are so similar. They're both married, they both have kids, they both work within their respective communities, and they're both small business owners. And the things that differentiate them in terms of what their parties offer, they're not really exciting people at the moment. And that's unusual. And I get it, because talking about things like crime and taxes, they're important, but they're not exciting for most people. Unless you get a really weird accountant. You might have a weird accountant, I don't know. These kind of things, though, mean that when you come to vote, it's down to personalities and who's more relatable, who's more likable, if you go to vote. You see, people not being excited or enthused about their options is one really powerful tool towards voter apathy. And that's always a risk with any democracy. And we've got elements in play here that we have never seen before, like no Green Party candidate, the fact that there is guaranteed a new MP from one of the two parties. That kind of stuff is really fascinating to watch. And where Ryan Hamilton is ranked on the National Party list, they seem fairly confident he can win. But if it comes down to personalities, well, the feedback seems to be that Georgie is a much more likeable, relatable candidate to somebody like Ryan, whose Christian conservative values and record of siding with a few of the crazy conspiracy theorists don't really bode well for him. So when it comes to how Hamilton East is going to vote, it's all up in the air. And in the past, having a look at their voting record, it's impossible to find a trend there. It's not a bellwether seat, it's not really consistent, it's not a safe red or blue seat, it just kind of moves almost randomly. And that's kind of cool. For me anyway, for somebody on the outside, it's kind of cool. So I will definitely be keeping an eye on Hamilton East on election night. Probably from Hamilton, but more on that later. Until next episode, guys, I'm all done and dusted. Next time we're actually going to be talking about some of those behaviors and attitudes we're seeing from those smaller, conservatively Christian, conspiracy-fueled political parties. So make sure you tune in for that. Until then, have yourselves a great week. Ka kite anō. I will catch you next time.